Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Polish Politics, your weekly summary of the most important events in Poland when it comes to politics. We usually come to you every Monday. If you haven't subscribed yet, I certainly invite you to do so you don't miss any of the future episodes. And a big shout out to all of our most loyal viewers who have already expressed some concerns over us not broadcasting a bit earlier today. That's actually because we have a very hot last minute news item for you, and that's why we're coming to it a bit later than usual. All right, let's jump straight into our first topic, which, as you could probably guess, will be the EU summit on Thursday. So this Thursday, there's this big EU event everyone is talking about, where the prime ministers and presidents of the 27 EU member states will decide on three key aspects: on the EU budget for 2021 to 2027, on the rule of law, and on the 750 billion post-corona recovery fund. Now, originally, the Commission has planned, or rather the German presidency has planned to vote on all of those three items together. But then came Hungary and Poland and announced that they might veto the EU budget in order to have an influence on the regulations surrounding the rule of law. Now, the rule of law itself is a difficult beast to tame, because ironically, the very regulation which is meant to be put in place will violate the separation of power within the EU in order to protect the separation of power in the EU member states. Why? Because it will give judiciary powers to the executive branch of the EU government. Right? So both the Commission and the Council are members of the executive branch, but they will have the power to rule over the application and the rule of law, or the quality of adherence to the rule of law that's present in any EU member state. And normally, those questions would be addressed by the EU courts, right? So now this power, this decision-making power, is transitioned from the EU Supreme Courts to the Commission and the Council. And in fact, this is a violation of the separation of power, especially since after the decision of the Council, there will be no appeal process. So, for instance, if you believe that the decision that you have violated the rules of law, or the rule of law, is unfair, the current setup does not foresee any means or any path for you to appeal this decision, and there should be. Because usually, both the Commission, for instance, can appeal certain decisions made by the country, and the country can also appeal certain decisions made by other EU institutions if they find that they violate, for instance, the European treaties. Here, however, the Council will be the only deciding factor, or the only deciding party. Which again is very, very ironic. Plus, remember that if you reduce, or if you limit the application of the rule of law to how we expend or how we spend EU subsidies, then you might actually not catch the violations of certain civil liberties that are happening in Poland right now. Right? So if you make it too tight, if you define the area where the rule of law can be applied in a very tight way, you might actually not bring any improvement to the situation of Polish citizens at all. But if you make it too wide, if you make it too vague, then it will not be precise enough to be applied with full confidence in the future, because then it will be a way for some, certainly for the powerful member states of the European Union, a way for them to introduce additional ways to pressure other countries which are members of the European Union to change, for instance, their internal policies, their economic policies, or even their social policies, which would be very risky and which would turn the principle of the rule of law into a means that can be used as an illegal instrument to influence other countries within the European Union. So no matter how you slice it, depending on the future interpretation of those regulations and depending on their future application, you will either have something that has no impact on people's everyday life, or you will have something that's far too powerful and far too dangerous. So as I mentioned in one of my previous episodes here, ideally we wouldn't need this regulation at all. But now, of course, nobody wants to back up. So why are we looking at Viktor Orbán all the time? One of the possible compromises on the table is to reduce the applicability of the rule of law only to spending EU subsidies. So if a certain regulation or if a certain activity by the government, for instance, does not have a direct influence on spending the EU budget, it will not be covered by the rule of law. And in that case, there's little hope or danger, depending on what your personal point of view is, that this will be applicable to Poland. However, Hungary is the European leader when it comes to fraud and corruption in relation to spending EU funds. Almost 4% of their EU budget spent in 2019 has been questioned because of fraud, because of incorrect procedures, etc. So if you limit the application of the rule of law just to EU funds, Poland will not be affected. Hungary, however, will be. And now, in theory, that's great for Poland, right? Or at least that's great for the peace government, because they can say, well, okay, we can agree to this rule of law if it only applies to EU funds, because we're not really affected. Our EU spending hasn't really caught anyone's attention, or hasn't produced any meaningful arguments and meaningful interventions. Nobody is really questioning how we are spending, or rather they are checking how we are spending the EU funds, and they are not finding any violations. So we're good to go. We can actually agree to this rule of law. However, Jarosław Kaczyński announced that our delegation will do whatever Viktor Orbán will do. So if Viktor Orbán will veto the EU budget to put pressure on the rule of law applicability, then Poland will follow their example, even if it's not relevant for Poland anymore. I do hope that this alliance will finally break, because it has proven very destructive to how the EU institutions are operating. And I do not recall a single instance where Poland would actually benefit from remaining loyal to Viktor Orbán. So this would actually be a great day, or a great pretext, to finally break this alliance. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that this will happen. So actually it will be very interesting to see how the events around Thursday and Friday, and possibly even over the weekend, will unfold, because as we know, EU negotiations can take many, many days to finally reach an agreement. My personal hope is that there will be an amendment to the rule of law regulations that will clearly state which areas of government and which areas of public policies might be affected and might be validated against this rule of law. So this instrument will not be used as a way to put pressure on other members of the European Union when it's not really about the rule of law, but it's about, for instance, strengthening your own economy. All right, so we shall see. We, of course, will keep you updated on any events around the EU summit, and will for sure deliver a very extensive commentary of the outcomes next Monday. Now, let's go to the hottest news of today, which is that Orlen, Polski koncern naftowy Orlen, so the Polish petroleum holding Orlen, has bought Polska Press. Now, you need to know that unlike in other European countries, which usually have a rather nation-oriented or locally owned media landscape, Polish media to a very large degree is owned by foreign investors, with all sorts of negative consequences that are associated when you don't really own your own media, right? Like foreign powers being able to influence public opinion, like the quality of journalism usually going down because it's all about numbers, it's all about revenue, it's all about circulation. You don't feel such a strong allegiance to the country that you're serving when you're owning, like imagine you're owning some newspaper in, I don't know, Guatemala, right? Or some other place in the world that you might not even have visited, okay? A random newspaper somewhere in Vietnam, okay? A local Vietnamese newspaper. Who do you think will be more interested and more determined to bring the most relevant news to the Vietnamese community? A local owner or someone sitting here in Central Europe or in Western Europe, right? Most likely a local owner. That's just how human psychology works, right? And at the end of the day, every investment decision or any decision that's business related is also made by human beings, right? So we cannot rule out psychology as or human psyche as a factor that would be influencing those decisions. Now, back to Polska Press. Polska Press basically has a monopoly when it comes to local daily newspapers in Poland. 20 out of the 24 daily newspapers that are being published are owned by Polska Press. And on top of that, they are owning about 120 weekly local titles, 120, okay? And about 500 domains, 500 local news portals. Those 500 domains alone reach roughly 17.4 to 17.5 million Polish users every month. So roughly half of Poland's population is reached by these online platforms or online portals alone. And it is really unique across Europe to see such a concentration of media owned by a single investor. That's because, or this was possible because the Polish parliament has never passed any law when it comes to print media that would limit how much you can own, how much of the total circulation or how much of the total market can be in one hand. And so this German-owned monopoly has been bought today by Orlen. You can argue that Poland has regained its print media sovereignty. Now, if you listen to other commentators, especially the ones who are supporting the civic platform, they will say actually something totally different. That this is an assault on the independence of our media, that this is a tragedy. This will end independent and free journalism. That we need to reinstate the Radio Wolna Europa, so Radio Free Europe radio. Maybe even the Voice of America broadcasting in Polish. You know, all sorts of Cold War actions. No, that's not the case. That's not the case. We need to start a journey away from being a media colony to our countries. And just like it is the case with overall economic development, we have basically three paths we can follow. One of them says that we will become an oligarchic state, ruled by an unofficial oligarchy of the richest 10, 20 people in the country. If you want to see how it feels to live in such a country, you can look to Russia, the Ukraine, to a certain but growing extent also to Hungary. This is really not something that is beneficial for the citizens living in such a country. The second option is relying on the free market. Unfortunately, the free market, especially when it comes to media, usually resides in concentrating the power when it comes to printing or when it comes to broadcasting as well in the hands of a few investors, usually multinational investors. And this also means that you as a citizen lose any impact on this media, right? Because you're not owning it. You have no influence on who is writing there, who's preparing the news, who's owning all those broadcast stations or newspapers. You have no influence at all, especially when you're faced with a monopoly. Because if there are no monopolies, if like the market is spread evenly, you can argue that, okay, you as a well-informed customer or well-informed consumer will pick the right media, and over time this media will rise in popularity and expand and become more popular, and more people start reading it, so it becomes more powerful and gains market share. But this is only possible if there's any competition. In a market where a single entity owns 83% of all titles and over 90% of all circulation, 90%, what competition do you expect? In many parts of Poland, there's a single local daily newspaper, a single one. There's no competition at all, not even on paper. So here we need to consider the third route. And the third route is, let's not go with an oligarchy, let's not become dependent on external investors, let's build a state-owned entity. Because if you have something that's state-owned, yes, it might fall victim to some politicians who feel the need to have too much influence on these media outlets. And that's a real threat, because remember, every choice in life, every solution that you aspire, or any recommendation that you support has its pros and cons. Especially in politics, there's never going to be a solution that's going to be 100% perfect for everybody. That's why we need to make very conscious and well thought out choices, right? So the benefits clearly outweigh the cons of a particular outcome. Because let's go back to these three different paths. If you have this state-owned path, then you can provide certain guarantees that wouldn't be possible if you would treat media as a regular, open, revenue-driven market, right? When they are state-owned, and after being bought by Orlen, who's basically state-owned, they are kind of state-owned, you can guarantee a level of security, for instance, for those who are writing there, for the journalists, that is unmatched by the current very rigid and very I would say, very hostile environment on the free journalistic market. Right now, journalists are treated very, very poorly. It's very hard to get a permanent contract. You're usually paid by the article, meaning, for instance, that if you want to present a different view, if you want to write something that's slightly different from what your owner wants you to write, you have absolutely no way of doing so, because you are dependent on getting paid by the word, let's say, or by the line, right? So if they don't like your article, you basically have no way to feed your family. And so you will always write whatever the owner wants you to write. And again, this hostile environment can be relieved if you install or if you implement measures of a regulated market, of a typical relationship between an employee and employer, right? Of long-term contracts, where you don't have to fear that you're not going to have money to feed your children next month, right? Where you can focus on high-quality journalism. Of course, this is only a possibility that you are getting because this is state-owned. But this is a possibility, it's not a guarantee, right? So, of course, you can ruin those newspapers if you have wrong leadership, if you write about stuff that nobody wants to read about, if you provide propaganda instead of journalism. So we shall see if Orlen and the Polish government will actually take advantage of those new possibilities that come with owning those newspapers in a good way, to increase the level of journalism, to provide more independence and more freedom to our journalists, so that we can finally read about the matters that are really important to us, rather than only stories that simply sell or stories that are dominated by advertising. For Orlen, this transaction is very, very positive. Orlen is certainly very much invested in diversifying their revenue streams, and they are doing on a company level what many of the Persian Gulf countries are doing on a country level. So they are reinvesting their current revenue and their current surplus based on selling petroleum and diesel and other typical fuels, carbon-based fuels, into new areas of business. And they're intending for these new areas of business to eventually take over and become their primary source of revenue in the process of decarbonizing our economy. So that's definitely positive for Orlen. I do hope that we will see far more benefits from regaining our print media sovereignty than negative effects, but of course only future can tell. And my last word on this: even if peace will indeed try to turn those newspapers into a big, nasty propaganda machine, remember, only if we're talking about state-owned enterprises do you have the opportunity to speak your mind during the next elections and vote for a change in the policies of those media companies, right? The decision will be yours. You will be in charge, just because they will be state-owned. When they are owned by a private entity, you have nothing to say. Right? So even if peace tries to demolish them, even if peace will lower their quality, there will be the next government, there will be the next parliamentary elections in 2023, or earlier, hopefully earlier, and you'll be able to change that, right? Because you will be in power. All right. Now, we looked into the future, but on our broadcast, we do not forget about the past either. And today, we are marking actually a very noteworthy anniversary, 50 years of the kneeling down of Willy Brandt before the monument for the victims of the Warsaw ghetto. This was a very remarkable sign. Remember, back in 1970, Willy Brandt was the first German Chancellor to visit Poland after World War II. Remember, back then, most of the people alive actually still remembered how it felt to fight against each other. On the Polish side, still remembered how it felt to lose your loved ones. Remember, 22% of all Polish citizens have been killed during World War II. So certainly the tensions and the reservations were very strong during this visit. However, it was also a positive visit for Poland. For the first time, Germany has acknowledged our western border, or at least acknowledged that they will not take any actions to change this border. It was actually finally acknowledged in 1990, but the 1970 agreement with Willy Brandt was the first step towards completely acknowledging and supporting our western border. So this was a major step in bringing more safety, more security to the Polish people and to our country. And of course, it was also an important symbol for the world, showing his sincere feelings of shame for what his fellow Germans have done. Because remember, Willy Brandt had nothing to do with the Nazis, right? Willy Brandt was trying to fight the Nazis, had to flee Germany, so he was clearly not associated in any way, in any shape or form with the Nazi regime. And so he was sincere in his condemnation for everything that the Germans have done around World War II. And yeah, it was a really remarkable. He was a really remarkable chancellor. Unfortunately, he had to step down in 1974 because of an internal crisis. A spy, an Eastern German spy, was discovered, Günter Gnome, in the inner circle of Willy Brandt. And so Willy Brandt, to protect the integrity of the office of the Chancellor, stepped down voluntarily. Another sign of him being really one of a very short list of extraordinary politicians in the second half of the 20th century. Thank you so much for staying with me throughout today's broadcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have comments or suggestions on what we should cover in the future, or any views you would like to share on the topics that we have already covered in the past, please do so. I'm more than happy to respond to your comments. Stay tuned and remember to tune in again next Monday, the latest, when we will certainly revisit the topic of the rule of law and talk extensively about the outcomes of this week's EU summit. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.